The streets of Birmingham carried a certain weight in the late 2010s, an invisible heaviness that ordinary people might never notice, but those who lived in the shadows could feel in every breath. Behind the facades of semi-detached houses and quiet cul-de-sacs, one of Europe's most dangerous drug cartels had taken root. At its center was a man whose very nickname sounded like a warning, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. To his neighbors, Kavanagh seemed like a respectable Irishman living abroad, a man who kept his business discreet and his family shielded from the public eye. But to law enforcement across the UK and Ireland, he was far more than that. He was the UK enforcer for the Kinahan Cartel, a sprawling criminal empire with tentacles reaching from Dublin to Dubai. From Spanish resorts to the streets of London, Kavanagh's presence in Britain was not accidental. The cartel needed a man on the ground who could move cocaine worth tens of millions across borders, who could intimidate rivals, and who could ensure the smooth flow of dirty money back to the heart of their operations. Kavanagh played that role with brutal efficiency. He was the muscle, the fixer, the shadow that loomed behind every shipment and every threat. For years, his operations remained cloaked, hidden behind coded conversations, legitimate business fronts, and a culture of fear that silenced those who might have spoken out. Yet no empire is invincible. Behind the scenes, investigators had begun to close in. Surveillance cameras watched his every movement. Intercepted phone calls revealed cracks in his armor. And in 2019, the illusion of untouchability shattered when police pulled open a truck to reveal an enormous cache of cocaine, its value running into tens of millions of pounds. The arrest of Thomas Kavanagh was more than just the downfall of one man. It was a seismic moment in the ongoing war between law enforcement and organized crime in the UK and Ireland. His capture exposed the scale of the Kinahan cartel's influence on British soil and revealed just how deeply Europe's underworld had become intertwined. This is the story of the rise and fall of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, the cartel's iron fist in the UK, the man who thought he could stay hidden in plain sight, and the police operation that finally brought him to his knees. Thomas Bomber. Kavanagh's arrest was not a standalone incident. It was the culmination of years of suspicion, surveillance, and patient detective work against one of the most powerful crime syndicates in Europe, the Kinahan Cartel. Born out of Dublin's violent drug wars of the 1990s, had expanded into an international organization controlling the supply of cocaine into Britain, Ireland, and beyond. Their profits ran into billions. But like any global enterprise, they needed trusted lieutenants to manage key territories. Kavanagh became that man for the UK. Operating primarily out of Tamworth in Staffordshire, just north of Birmingham, he was both a family man and a feared gangster. From a large, gated property, he oversaw logistics that moved drugs and laundered money through an intricate web of companies, couriers, and coded channels. His nickname, Bomber, reflected not only his intimidating presence, but also his readiness to unleash violence when necessary. The breakthrough came in 2019, when customs officials and police intercepted a truck, hidden in the panels and beneath legitimate cargo. They uncovered a haul of cocaine, with an estimated street value in the tens of millions. It was a staggering discovery, one that not only disrupted the cartel's immediate supply chain, but also exposed Kavanagh's central role in its UK branch. What followed was a swift but meticulously planned series of arrests. The case against him pieced together surveillance evidence, financial records, and testimony from insiders. In court, prosecutors painted Kavanagh as a ruthless organizer, someone who had used his reputation and fear tactics to dominate the UK market for the Kinahan empire. His downfall sent shockwaves through both the underworld and ordinary communities. It demonstrated that the Kinahan's reach into Britain was not abstract. It was real, tangible, and entrenched. But it also showed that police, working across borders, could strike back. The case of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh stands as a microcosm of modern organized crime, global in scale, hidden in plain sight, and always one step from collapse when the right evidence emerges. Thomas Bomber Kavanagh was not born into wealth or privilege. His path into crime was shaped by the same forces that molded much of Dublin's underworld in the 1980s and 1990s. Poverty, opportunity, and a culture of violence that blurred the lines between survival and ambition. Kavanagh grew up in Ireland, where the Kinahan name was already beginning to rise in notoriety. Daniel Kinahan and his father, Christy Dapper Don Kinahan, had established themselves as key figures in Dublin's heroin trade, before expanding into the much more lucrative cocaine market. For young men like Kavanagh, aligning with such a powerful syndicate offered wealth, protection, and status far beyond what ordinary life could provide. The Kinahans needed soldiers, people they could trust to enforce debts, manage disputes, and secure shipments. Kavanagh's combination of physical presence and ruthless reputation made him an ideal candidate. Over time, he proved himself more than just muscle. He understood logistics, hierarchy, and the value of discretion. By the time he moved to England permanently, he was already a seasoned operator with deep ties to the cartel's leadership. Settling in Tamworth, Staffordshire, Kavanagh cultivated a dual identity. On one side was the image of a settled family man, living with his wife and children in a large gated property. On the other was the enforcer, the man whose word carried weight across Birmingham, London, and the Irish Sea. Locals sometimes whispered about the expensive cars that passed through his driveway, or the visitors from Dublin who arrived without explanation. Still, his ability to blend into a quiet English town helped him avoid scrutiny for years. The main characters orbiting Kavanagh's life tell a larger story of the Kinahan network. At the top sat Daniel Kinahan, often described as the mastermind of the cartel, now living in Dubai and running operations with a businessman's veneer. His father, Christie Sr., carried the old-school gravitas of a godfather, maintaining the organization's legacy and wealth. Beneath them were a constellation of lieutenants, couriers, accountants, or smugglers who formed the logistical backbone of the enterprise. Kavanagh's role was both strategic and brutal. When negotiations failed, he enforced order. When shipments needed security, he arranged the transport. And when rivals threatened the cartel's dominance in Britain, he made sure the threat disappeared, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through violence. His presence was the cartel's insurance policy on UK soil. This network wasn't limited to Ireland and Britain. Spain's Costa del Sol, a favorite haven for Irish gangsters, served as another hub. Dubai became a command center. Money laundering stretched into the Netherlands, Belgium, and beyond. But in the UK, one name kept resurfacing in police intelligence reports: Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. He was the connective tissue between the Kinahans' Irish roots and their British ambitions. By the late 20s and 10s, Kavanagh had grown into more than just an enforcer. He was a kingpin in his own right, orchestrating operations worth tens of millions. Yet with each success, the attention of law enforcement grew sharper, and the walls of secrecy began to thin. To understand Thomas Bomber Kavanagh's power, one must look at the machinery of crime he helped run in the United Kingdom. The Kinahan cartel was not a loose group of thugs. It was a multinational business empire dealing in narcotics. Kavanagh's branch of that empire specialized in moving enormous quantities of cocaine across borders, concealing it in trucks, cars, and shipping containers that blended seamlessly into legitimate trade routes. At the center of his operation was logistics. The UK is both an island and a hub. Ports, highways, and airports form arteries through which millions of goods flow daily. Kavanagh exploited that infrastructure. Trucks carrying seemingly ordinary cargo would conceal packages of cocaine worth millions. The drugs came in from mainland Europe, often through the Netherlands or Belgium, before slipping across the channel into Britain. Once inside the country, the product was broken down, distributed, and sold on the streets of cities from London to Manchester. His headquarters in Tamworth was no ordinary suburban home. Behind the high gates and security systems, it functioned like a command center. Trusted lieutenants would arrive to discuss shipments and payments. Vehicles were regularly rotated, and phones were frequently discarded to minimize surveillance risks. Money was laundered through a combination of cash businesses, property investments, and front companies. Some of these businesses looked completely legitimate from the outside. A car dealership here, a transport company there, but each was designed to blur the trail of cartel profits. Kavanagh also maintained a network of couriers, men willing to drive across borders, carrying hidden compartments stuffed with cash or drugs. Their loyalty was reinforced by both fear and financial reward. Those who considered betrayal quickly learned that the cartel's reputation for violence was not an empty threat. It was whispered in pubs and on street corners that Kavanagh could make people disappear, that debts to him were always collected, one way or another. But perhaps the most striking element of his operation was its scale. In 2019, when police intercepted a truck and discovered cocaine worth tens of millions of pounds, It was clear that Kavanagh was not just a middleman. He was orchestrating shipments on a level usually reserved for international cartels in South America. The sheer volume suggested not only access to suppliers at the source, but also sophisticated channels of distribution across Europe. Despite the cloak of secrecy, cracks began to form. Surveillance revealed patterns, frequent trips, coded conversations, unexplained wealth. Investigators built a picture of an organization running parallel to normal society, hidden in plain sight. And at the center of that picture, again and again, stood Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, the enforcer turned orchestrator, the man who made the Kinahans untouchable in Britain until the day he wasn't. By the time Thomas Bomber Kavanagh's name was firmly in the crosshairs, British law enforcement had already learned painful lessons about the Kinahan cartel. Previous cases had shown how deeply the organization infiltrated legitimate industries and how ruthlessly it protected its interests. To bring down someone like Kavanagh, the police could not rely on a single raid or an informant's whisper. They needed patience, coordination, and a web of surveillance stretching across borders. The National Crime Agency (NCA), often described as the UK's equivalent of the FBI, took the lead. Working with customs officials and local police forces, the NCA launched an extensive operation targeting the Kinahan's UK infrastructure. Surveillance teams followed vehicles, recorded patterns of movement, and installed covert cameras. Every suspicious shipment, every cash drop, was catalogued. They built a mosaic of evidence, each tile small on its own, but devastating in combination. Wiretaps and intercepted communications added another layer. The cartel often spoke in code, using terms that seemed harmless but referred to drugs or money. Yet patterns emerged. Investigators slowly deciphered the language, piecing together details of shipments that were planned, executed, and then concealed within the flow of everyday commerce. Meanwhile, customs officers at ports and borders were on high alert. Random inspections became carefully calculated operations, guided by intelligence from the NCA. It was during one of these inspections in 2019 that officers uncovered the jackpot, a hidden consignment of cocaine worth tens of millions of pounds. It was more than just a seizure. It was proof that Kavanagh's network was operating at the highest level of organized crime. The discovery set in motion a cascade of action. Search warrants were prepared. Financial records were traced to front companies linked to Kavanagh. International partners in Ireland, Spain, and the Netherlands shared intelligence, closing gaps that criminals often exploited. Bit by bit, the secrecy that had shielded the Kinahans began to crumble. What distinguished this investigation was its scale and persistence. Kavanagh had lived in Tamworth for years, cultivating the aura of a respectable businessman. But behind that suburban calm, law enforcement had been watching, waiting for the right moment. That moment arrived with the cocaine seizure, transforming suspicion into hard evidence. The hunter had finally found his prey. Every criminal empire eventually faces the moment when its carefully woven web begins to unravel. For Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, that moment came in 2019. Until then, he had managed to maintain the delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and secrecy that kept his operation alive. But one truckload of cocaine changed everything. It was a seemingly routine journey, another lorry making its way across borders, carrying what appeared to be legitimate goods. But customs officers, armed with intelligence from months of surveillance, flagged it for inspection as the panels were stripped away. The true cargo emerged, packages of pure cocaine, compressed and wrapped, hidden deep within the vehicle's structure. The street value ran into the tens of millions of pounds. It was a staggering haul, one that could not be dismissed as a mistake or a one-off job. The seizure provided police with the golden thread they needed to unravel the entire tapestry of Kavanagh's operation. For years, suspicions had circled him, but nothing concrete could stick. Now, there was undeniable proof. This was not a minor courier operation. It was a major artery of the Kinahan cartel pumping narcotics into Britain, and Kavanagh was the one holding the syringe. Behind the scenes, the interception triggered a shift in strategy. Investigators who had once been cautious began moving with precision. Warrants were prepared, assets were scrutinized, and financial flows were traced with renewed urgency. For Kavanagh, the walls began closing in, though he might not have realized it at first. Men like him often believed they were untouchable, protected by silence, intimidation, and the cartel's reputation. But the interception of that truck shattered the illusion. It gave law enforcement leverage in court, credibility in the eyes of juries, and momentum to press forward. It also sent ripples of fear through Kavanagh's associates, some of whom worried that their own roles might soon be exposed. Loyalties wavered, confidence cracked. The turning point had arrived, and there was no going back. For the cartel, it was a costly setback. For Kavanagh, it was the beginning of the end, the moment when his empire began to crumble under the weight of evidence. The hunter and the hunted had finally collided. And this time, the hunted would not escape. The moment the investigation reached critical mass, law enforcement moved in with surgical precision. By 2019, the net around Thomas Bomber Kavanagh had been drawn tight. His home in Tamworth, the supposed fortress of a respectable family man, became the focal point of a dramatic raid that would expose the cartel's UK stronghold. Armed officers and investigators from the National Crime Agency arrived at dawn. The quiet suburban street was suddenly filled with flashing lights, the sound of boots on tarmac, and the heavy thud of doors being forced open. Inside, Kavanagh's property revealed not only the trappings of wealth, luxury cars, designer clothes, and expensive jewelry, but also evidence of his role as the Kinahan cartel's UK enforcer. Documents, encrypted phones, and cash bundles pointed to a sophisticated criminal network operating far beyond local turf wars. Kavanagh himself was taken into custody with little resistance. Those who knew him expected violence, perhaps even a standoff, but the reality was quieter. Years of investigation had left him cornered, and the scale of the evidence was overwhelming. Alongside him, several associates were also arrested in coordinated operations across the Midlands and beyond. The strategy was clear: dismantle not just the man, but the infrastructure that had enabled him. The raids exposed the sheer audacity of his operation. Vehicles fitted with hidden compartments, ledgers detailing coded transactions, and surveillance equipment used to monitor rivals. All of it painted a picture of a man who believed he could outsmart the system indefinitely. But the discovery of the multi-million-pound cocaine haul had already pulled the thread loose. The raids only confirmed the scale. For the cartel, the blow was devastating. Losing their UK enforcer meant more than just one man in custody. It meant the collapse of their logistics hub in Britain. For local communities, the arrest was a surreal moment. Proof that the quiet man living behind gates had in fact been running one of Europe's largest drug pipelines. As Kavanagh was led away in handcuffs, the message was clear: even the most feared gangster could be brought down when patience, persistence, and cross-border cooperation came together. The myth of invincibility was gone, replaced by the cold reality of a prison cell awaiting him. When Thomas Bomber Kavanagh finally faced trial, the courtroom became a stage where years of secrecy, intimidation, and criminal logistics were laid bare. Prosecutors wasted no time in portraying him as more than just a cog in the Kinahan machine. They painted him as the man who had turned Britain into a crucial artery for one of Europe's most dangerous cartels. The evidence was overwhelming. Jurors were shown details of the multi-million-pound cocaine haul discovered in the truck, photographs of hidden compartments in vehicles, and records of encrypted phone communications that tied Kavanagh directly to cartel shipments. Financial investigators presented a parallel picture: unexplained wealth funneled through property, luxury cars, and front businesses. To the prosecution, it was clear that this was no ordinary criminal, but a senior figure in a sophisticated and ruthless network. Kavanagh's defense tried to downplay his role, suggesting he was a businessman unfairly targeted because of his Irish connections. Yet the weight of evidence crushed any such narrative. Witnesses described his reputation for violence and his position as the cartel's enforcer. Surveillance footage showed his frequent meetings with known associates. Piece by piece, the mosaic assembled by the National Crime Agency was put on display, leaving little room for doubt. In July 2022, the verdict came. Thomas Bomber Kavanagh was sentenced to 21 years in prison, a punishment that reflected not only the seriousness of the crimes, but also his central role in the Kinahan cartel's UK operations. The judge described him as a major player in international drug trafficking and emphasized the devastating impact his actions had on communities across Britain. For law enforcement, the sentencing was a landmark victory. For the Kinahans, it was a major loss, stripping them of their strongest foothold in Britain. And for Kavanagh himself, it was the end of the illusion of untouchability, a once feared gangster now reduced to a number in the prison system. His empire dismantled, his power gone. The fall of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh marked one of the most significant blows ever struck against the Kinahan cartel on British soil. His arrest and 21-year sentence stripped the organization of its UK enforcer, the man who had guaranteed the smooth flow of cocaine worth tens of millions into Britain. For communities plagued by addiction and violence, it was a symbolic victory, proof that even the most formidable criminal networks could be pierced. Yet the story is not one of neat closure. The Kinahans remain, their operations stretching from Dubai to Spain. Their influence still felt across Europe's drug trade. Removing Kavanagh weakened their infrastructure in the UK, but it did not dismantle the empire. Other lieutenants are waiting in the wings, new enforcers eager to step into the void he left behind. For law enforcement, the case underscores both triumph and challenge. Yes, a feared gangster was taken down, but the resources, patience, and international cooperation required to bring him to justice highlight just how resilient and adaptive organized crime has become. As for Kavanagh, the man once known as Bomber, his empire lies in ruins, and his family life has been consumed by the shadow of his crimes. The question that lingers is whether his downfall will truly weaken the Kinahan machine, or whether it will serve only as a cautionary tale of one enforcer who believed he could hide forever in plain sight.